back to Karl's Chronicles. I'm glad you can join us again today. Today we're going to talk about something a little different, something I've been working on for a while. And it has to do with what I call the Theodicy of God, God's wrath, the justice of God. To begin, I've been doing some research on an independent ministry that the way they present God is almost as if God doesn't kill. And so we need some proper balance there. And there, of course, those on the other side who believe that the God of the Old Testament is somehow evil and vicious, and he's not like the God of the New Testament, and these are different things. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I might bring this out into two presentations. We're going to lay some of the groundwork today. This is based off an idea of what's called theodicy. And theodicy is a word coined in the 17th century. That it comes from two Greek words, theos for God and dike for just or righteous. And it's a system or construct, theological construct for understanding and studying the righteousness or justice of God. And it deals with the question of suffering in a sinful world. Why does God allow suffering? Or is a sinful world that we live in, is there a righteous God? Can he be compatible with this kind of world? These are kinds of the questions that this asks. Theodicy seems to be the issue in making a lot of atheists, a lot of unbelievers. I have been within my own family. My brother back 60 years ago, young boy, had issues with his dad. His dad got cancer. Of course, I'm speaking of my father too. This is my brother. And but about a year before he died, or a little bit before he died, he was beginning to make inroads to understanding him. And a young boy needs to kind of get this closure with his father. And he had asked God in a prayer that he would spare his dad's life for another year at least. He wasn't saying, God, heal him, take away the cancer, but give me one more year with him to settle these issues before he's gone. But that didn't happen. And because of that, my brother fell into unbelief. God did not answer his prayer. And it all stems, like I said, from this question or issue of theodicy. Many atheists have been made from this. And we have the movie that's pretty popular out there. Is it God is Not Dead 1, the first movie, where the professor is an atheist. It's in the philosophy class, and he wants all the students at the beginning of the class to write down that God is dead or some sort of thing, that there is no God. And get that settled so they can move on to the next section of the book. And everybody would get a passing grade, if they did this. But there was one holdout who would not do that. And it seems our professor had the same kinds of issues regarding a death of a family member, where he had prayed for their life to be spared. And I think in the story it was his mother. Again, comes back to the point of theodicy. What do we do with that? Interesting that Gottfried Leibniz, who was the one who came up with the term, was a philosopher, and in his idea, in his construct, he saw the world as it is right now as the best world that God could make. I find that amazing. We know that in the Bible, God created the world, and at the end of each day, he says, and it was good. He made the world perfect and upright. It was when the fall of man occurred, when human beings brought sin into the world, that things begin to fall apart. The world that we live in right now, as it is not the world that God created it to be. This isn't so. This is part of the rebellion. And that's what we need to begin to understand. In this idea of sin and death, we want to pin on God, that God was able to keep these things from happening. Well, he could have kept it from happening at the very beginning. And for us to really understand a theodicy, what's going on here, we probably need to understand how that pairs with what's called the wrath of God. Because again, that's another thing a lot of people see as capricious, something that is off the cuff that God does because he's angry with you. We think of God's anger in terms of humanity, how humans get angry, and that can't be. God's wrath is not the wrath that could be equated to human wrath. It's the same as his love. It's not the same as human love. That love is above all things. And so we need to have that proper understanding. And I like to start with talking about the concepts of God's wrath in the context of his gospel. That takes us to Romans. Paul's gospel to the Romans. The letter, the epistle to the Romans was written as Paul was preparing to move from Antioch to Rome and use that as a new stepping out point to reaching out further beyond to the edges of Spain with the gospel as he prepared to take his ministry to the next level. And so in this here, he makes the statement that he's not ashamed of the gospel. We'll take a look at it here in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. These two verses, 16 and 17, are the really founding verses of the Reformation. But we're going to include verse 18 as well because there's a contrast that I want to make here. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. It's the first time he quotes Habakkuk 2. And he does so again later in Galatians, and if you believe he wrote the book of Hebrews, there again as well. Here we see that the gospel is God's power. It's the power to save, and it's manifested in God's righteousness. And we need to realize that God's righteousness here is not just that he's good, because he is, but because he's just. That's the more narrow view of the word that gets translated righteousness. So read it more in the context of, for in the justice of God is revealed. The gospel is revealed in the fact that God is a just God. This is what gives the gospel power. And this is the thing that God is using, not just to save humans, but to restore the planet from sin and put it back the way it was before sin entered into the universe. This is very important stuff. And we need now to contrast this with verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. They know the truth, and they suppress the truth, maybe out of fear of belief in God, that they will have to answer for their lives at the end. And so they want God to go away. But here is what we see as the contrast between God's gospel of justice and his wrath. God has done everything he can to restore mankind back to the way they were before sin entered into the cosmos. And that if we fail to receive so great a gift, all that's left is his wrath, is his condemnation. Let's go back into Genesis, chapters 2 and 3. He tells them in chapter 2 that Adam and Eve, that in the day you eat of the fruit from the tree of life, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It says, that day you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, the serpent comes down, and he tempts them. He says, no, you won't die. He says, you're going to be like God, knowing good and evil. So they think God is holding out on them. Eating this fruit is going to take them to the next level of being human. They're going to be like God. And so by eating the fruit, they basically took God out of the center of their life, replaced it with themselves. That's the whole basis of sin to begin with. And in this rebellion, they joined the serpent in his battle against God. Now we become the enemies of God, warring against him. And God, who told them that day, the day you eat of it, I'm going to destroy you. You will die. Now the serpent sits back and waits. God has a choice. He can do what he said he's going to do, destroy him, or he can show mercy. What does God do? He shows mercy. He spares their life. He doesn't do away with them. What he does is in Genesis 3:15, he presents them with the issue that's going on. A promise of a prolonged battle. I could end it today by destroying you, or I can continue the war, in which at the end of it, you'll have a positive outcome. He says to the woman, your seed, an offspring from a human, is going to deal the death blow to the serpent. But the serpent will only bruise his heel. He'll think he killed him, but he won't. It won't be fatal. This is the promise of the coming Messiah, right there. This is the promise that God has made a way through this world of sin. And not some arbitrary thing where he destroys people. He's found a way to save people. Right from the very beginning. This culminates in the book of Revelation. Go with me to Revelation chapter 21. In chapter 21 is the conclusion of the whole matter. Everything coincides right here. This is where the promises of the covenant that were made to Israel find their ultimate fulfillment. Remember, the covenants weren't just something God made with Israel. This starts back in Genesis chapter 11, where they're building the Tower of Babel, and all the nations have gathered together to make a name for themselves, and they're building this tower, this gate to God, for themselves. To acclaim their own name. And God, seeing his name is not in the world, now calls himself a nation to put his name back in the world. And he begins there at the end of chapter 11, beginning and in chapter 12, he calls a man. He calls Abram from the city of Ur. And from Abram he calls a nation, the nation of Israel, that's now exiled, taken, given an exodus, given freedom out of the bondage of Egypt. And from there, this nation is to be the light to the world, putting God's name back in. And from that nation, Israel, he calls the whole world. Is to be a message to bringing in the Gentiles. As he says in Isaiah says, talking about what God is saying, that I will be found by a people who have not sought me. And that's the rest of the world. That's the Gentiles. This is the culmination here in Revelation, where everything comes to be. Let me get back to the text here. And so this is what we read, Revelation chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. And then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be with them, and be their God. This is the promise. This is the covenant statement made, ultimately, where back in Exodus 8, God asked that the freed Israelites build them a tabernacle in the midst of them, that he may place a manifestation of his presence there so he can be among his own people. So he says, build me a tabernacle that I might dwell with you. Now in the end, this new city comes down, and he says, now you dwell with me in the forever city. The covenants find the fulfillment here. And he finishes here with, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. This is the culmination of all of Scripture, right here, from Genesis to Revelation. And that's what we see here. The idea of this Old Testament God being so vicious is not new. We see it in the early church, in the mid-2nd century, and a theologian named Marcion, who was turning towards a Gnostic view. We'll talk about Gnosticism here in a second. But Marcion of Sinop had this idea that the God of the Old Testament was not the God of the New Testament who sent Jesus into the world. And that this God of the Old Testament is what was looked at through the Greek eyes of the demiurge. The demiurge was something that was the creator of the physical world. And the demiurge could be eternal or could be created himself. There was various views about this at different time periods. But the fact is, it is this demiurge that Marcion says is the God of the Old Testament. This is the capriciousness of the material world. You see, the philosophy of the Greeks was that the material things are bad, unmaterial things, the spiritual realm is good. And this would lead to what we become known as Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know. And not just to know, have knowledge, but to knowledge that is experienced. The idea of Gnosticism was the idea that salvation is based off knowledge. The esoteric, the deep things of God would save one, would provide salvation, the pathway to God, to deity, to the spiritual realm. And this was not just a philosophy of the Greeks, but it began to find its way into Christianity. And many sects adapted forms of Christianity blended with Gnosticism. And this idea then became that the physical world being bad, that when Jesus manifested himself here in this world in his first advent, he did not come as a real human being. He only appeared to come as a human being. He wasn't in the flesh. It was what was referred to as the phantom Christ. And this is the appearance that he had, and only appeared to die on the cross. And some say that it was Judas that took his place on the cross. So this phantom Christ is the one who the Gnostics speak of, because the material world was bad and that we are trying to get back into the spiritual world. Well, we know that Jesus was material. John says in 1 John, in his first epistle, that anyone who says that Christ did not come in the flesh is Antichrist. We see there at the creation event that at the end of each day God says, and it was good. Being material is not bad. Being in the material world, in and of itself, is not sin. What sin is when sin came into this material world and things became corrupt. It's sin that had corrupted it. So it's not the basis that it's material. It's the reason why it's corrupt is because of sin and rebellion. And so that's the picture we need to have an understanding of. And this goes completely contrary to the idea of Gnosticism, which is still with us today. Marcion continued with his beliefs, and later on in about the later 3rd century, a Parthian named Mani began a religious movement that was also holding to very similar Gnostic beliefs. And his system became known as Manichaeism. Manichaeism had an influence on Christianity, and this is the same thing that we have with this idea of the physical and the spiritual realms. The physical being bad and the spiritual being good. And in his mindset, the Old Testament, we see the God creating a physical world, and this was, of course, bad. This wasn't a good picture. This wasn't the right picture, according to the Manichees. And so, these are the big influences that we have in those first centuries, especially, of Christianity, that still linger with us today. We look at the book by Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, which is the book for the Freemasons. And in there he deals with the issues of the Kabbalah, and that the God who created the physical world, Yahweh or Yehovah, was the bad God, and that Lucifer was the good God. He was the spiritual God. He was the God of light, the morning star. He was the Satan, the accuser. And so they flipped the story in that book, where the Creator God was bad, Satan now becomes good. There's all kinds of stories dealing with these issues about how God is looked at in the Old Testament. I've got 23 verses here about the goodness of God, and I'm going to post them in the description section under the video, where you can open them up, you can copy and paste them, or write them down however you want. And we're going to deal with, in the next episode, about some of the issues out of the Old Testament that seem to show God unjust, and I'm going to explain some things to show that there is a just God, and that these weren't capricious acts. People have talked about, for instance, how God had allowed the Benjamites to be killed. And this is almost laughable, because it tells me that these people have not read the scriptures. They take these things arbitrarily, and then they accuse God of being something he's not. But they haven't taken the time to think it through, or to actually even read the material. I can't believe they read the material if they're going to make statements like that. So we're going to cover some of that and kind of give you some ideas about God's goodness in the Old Testament. So before we finish, Again, I want to remind you of the 23 verses that you can pick up under the description. We're going to talk about some of the examples of the wrath of God in the next episode, and hopefully kind of give you a picture of what's really going on. Remember, at the basis of this, the world that we live in right now is not the world God created it to be. This isn't the way He wanted it. The way the world is now is because of sin. And God had been working all along, from the very beginning, to expunge sin from the cosmos, without affecting human will. I mean, He could have obliterated Satan right from the very beginning, but what would that have done? We'll talk about that later on as well. So in the meantime, I hope you find this encouraging a little bit, and thank you for stopping by. Stop by again.